Absolutely. Mike Heiser, Dr. Michael Heiser, has really devoted a lot of his research into what he calls re-mythologizing the Bible. And basically what he's doing is trying to put back into the Bible the spiritual war that Paul writes about in Ephesians and elsewhere in the New Testament, back into the Old Testament. So we understand that the history of the Hebrews and the Israelites is really a history of the fallen sons of God, B'nai Elohim, trying to wipe out the bloodline through which our kinsman redeemer would come. And once you understand that essentially it's the 70 fallen B'nai Elohim trying to wipe out the Israelites, the Hebrews, and God intervening supernaturally to protect that bloodline, the history of the Old Testament makes so much more sense. In fact, Mike has even gone so far as to outline and chart and map the conquest of Canaan by Joshua and the Hebrews, and then matches that up against the location of the giants that are recorded in Deuteronomy and Joshua and so forth. You know, the other names by which they're known, like the Zamzumim and so forth, and I can't remember the others. But essentially, when you chart it out and then you look linguistically at the tribes that were being wiped out, he shows that it was a war of conquest against the remaining giants in the land.
And there's
really
wow. And there's very few shows that talk about these kind of topics, but and I know you understand this, Derek and Sharon, is that when you start understanding these things, we now have answers when people are skeptical of God and say, well, look at all the people that God killed in the Old Testament, in the flood or in Canaan or whatever, and now we have a clear understanding that God was working an act of compassion for all mankind. We understand why sexual purity and things like bestiality and other things were such grievous type things, because we understand terrible things were afoot that could really hurt mankind, and we can't really go into all that today. But it's just an example of the kind of things that I found, the open dialogue that we're now having. And I just might mention Dr. Heiser, who I hope we can have back. We haven't had him back since the early days of
That sounds like an awfully good guest right there.
Dr. Heiser is extremely well-credentialed, professor of theology.
Plus, he has a new book that he's going to be. When is that coming out?
I don't know. I know he's working on a book right now that is aimed at lay people, which goes back and explains all of this in layman's terms, called The Myth That Is True. He's got a working draft that he's kind of distributing around to some people that subscribe to his newsletter and so forth. And we've been blessed to read some of the work in progress. But you're right. He's credentialed, and he's one of the few scholars who has earned the respect, I think, of secular critics who understand that, this is a guy who's done his research. He's not making assertions based on his own personal prejudices. This is a guy who's only going where the evidence leads, and that's why he keeps getting back on Coast to Coast AM.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. He's also a specialist in those local languages, in Aramaic and Ugaritic and ancient Hebrew and Greek and all those
Egyptian,
things I can't speak. And he knows the history of the area. He knows all of the little idiosyncrasies that would work into translating a given passage of Scripture correctly. And, he's brought all of that to the table in the books he's written. And I've learned a ton from Mike Heiser. And it's helped me. I had the blessing of growing up in a church that taught a lot of this stuff anyway when I was a kid growing up. So I sort of started off running, where Derek, had to catch up. But trust me, he passed me long ago.
Yeah.
But if you take a look, it's really easy to say, well, God, he was hateful, he was killing people off, how dare he bring that flood? Those people had, you could say, almost 1,000 years lead time. Mm-hmm. Because Methuselah's name means when he dies, the end comes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the day Methuselah died is the day it started raining. And Noah had 100 years warning. So he was preaching for 100 years while he was building the boat. Right. So it wasn't like it was, one day Noah starts building a boat. 2 weeks later, after some HGTV crew comes in and helps him build the boat, all of a sudden it's raining and everybody gets killed. Mm-hmm. But God, as Derek said, he was doing it out of compassion because Noah was the only one who genetically was unsullied.
Yeah, perfect in his generations.
Right. Yeah, there's some other things I want to talk about. I don't want to just focus on this one topic, but back to Dr. Heiser again. He's just an example of the kind of typical guest that we would have on Future Quake or on your show that can very powerfully and effectively contend for the faith on Mars Hill amongst secular people. Are very, very effective in defending the gospel and has answers that people are looking for that other people have not heard in their churches as well. And it's not only been enlightening to me, but people who are just curious about Christianity and wonder about how do they address these very, very tough issues. And in fact, I was so challenged when I came back from this Roswell Bible Conference. It was actually held during the UFO Festival back in 2005. I met so many incredibly intelligent, enlightened Christian brothers and sisters that I began to think about the prophecy of Joel, about in the last days that men would see dreams and visions, and that in the end of Daniel, when it says in the last days, knowledge would greatly increase. And I just often wondered if, in fact, we're just seeing something akin to the days of the wise men at the first advent of Christ, that there are all these people who are rising with fresh understandings of Scripture. This happened at the time when Christ first appeared on earth, and in time for a second advent, people are having clear understandings now of interpreting what's going on in the world from an end times perspective.
I absolutely agree with you. I really do. When you take a look at the book of Revelation, there's a phrase that is repeated over and over again by Christ, and it's those who have ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit saith to the churches. Back then, and even today in many churches like the Catholic Church, back then Scripture tended to be read. You didn't have a Bible that you brought with you or a bunch of scrolls that you brought with you and you sat reading along with the speaker. It was generally you heard it. And I believe what he's saying is there are some people who are going to get it right away, and other people may have to gain those ears to hear. And I think that what we're seeing in these last days is that more and more people are getting it.
What's interesting, though, is that some of the most creative and I think insightful study and writing that's being done in terms of end times prophecy and understanding prophecy is being done by independent writers and thinkers, guys who aren't being published by the major Christian publishing houses. People like David Lowe, Peter Goodgame, Patrick Heron, even guys like Mike Heiser, Guy Malone, people, Lynn Marzulli.
And to a certain extent, these guys are marginalized.
They're marginalized. They're not finding major publishing houses. They're not being invited to. In fact, in some cases, they and people who try to discuss their work are being kicked off of of some major Christian forums because they don't conform to traditional Christian end-time theory. So,
and that's why we need our regular listeners to provide positive feedback, whether it's to book publishers or to radio stations you're hearing carrying shows like this, to
or
say,
even
hey,
to WENO.
Yeah, there's audiences, there's audience out there that wants to hear and understand these kind of things, and hear from them, and that's why we really need to support people who are getting this message out. And take it forward. Hey, I want to ask you something real quick about your show. Can you share with us some of your more memorable moments on the show since you've been on air, or some provocative comments that have been made on the air by some of your guests?
I'll tell you what. One of my favorite.
That's a can of worms right there.
one of my favorite moments was. I think it was when you were just giving the email address one time. And I didn't quite hear the R in peering. And I even said something to you about, not quite hearing it. And we got an email from Tom Horn shortly after that, and he said, my wife and I were listening to that, and we almost drove off the road. We were laughing so hard.
Doing what in the darkness?
Well, at least it wasn't as bad as what's happened on Future Quake in the past, and this was before Tom Bionic. A previous co-host of mine added his 2 cents. I was in the middle of speaking during a show live, broadcast live, and I heard a funny sound on the radio, and I looked over, and he was sound asleep and snoring into the microphone.
Oh, my gosh.
While I was talking. So, that's the effect I have on people, even in studio.
You know what? Something that did happen to us when Derek used to have a show that he did at a terrestrial radio station back in, as opposed to extraterrestrial,
Right. Yes.
back in Missouri. And he and I were, he was kicking off what he called Off-Road Friday, and I went in there for the first one just to sort of, prime the pump, so to speak, just in case he didn't get any callers. Well, he got tons of them, it turned out. But while we were sitting in there, we were talking about ghosts in Missouri. And this banging on the wall that we to this day don't know what caused it started happening.
Yeah, I forgot about that because there were several very loud thumps on the wall, but the point in the wall at which the noise was originating was the wall between the talk studio for our station and the studio for our sister sports talk station, and the host. Who was on the air in there, heard the thumps too, and had no clue as to what would have happened. I mean, he wasn't clearly he wasn't taking time out from his own show and taking his own calls.
He just assumed that we had hit the wall.
He thought we had hit the wall. We thought he'd hit the wall. It wasn't on the roof because there was a second floor above our.
Right.
No, there wasn't either. But there was nobody on the roof. It was a flat roof.
There was a second floor above us, but it definitely sounded like it was coming from that wall.
Yeah.
And your producer at the time just about freaked out.
Yeah, a young man who was a college junior at the time, and he was, just really, really spooked. His eyes were as big as saucers on most of the Off-Road Friday shows we did, especially when we had, the demonologists on and had Russ Dizdar, a deliverance minister on, and so we get to talking about demons and demonic possession and things like that, and he just would tend to freak out. But this, as we were talking about ghosts, really spooked him in a big way. Now, it didn't bother us because we thought, well, if this is the worst the enemy can throw at us, then...
That's right. That's just sour grapes. What about guests? What about any provocative comments any of your guests have made where you just sort of sit back in your chair and said, oh, my goodness?
One of the things that really struck me as being a very bold statement, and I mentioned earlier that Tom Horn, who's the publisher of Raiders News Update, Raiders News Network, and is now is the man behind Anomalous Publishing. I mentioned earlier that he was very emotional when talking about dominionism, which he calls a heresy, flat out a heresy. When he said that not only did he consider dominionism a heresy, he considers it the means by which the Antichrist will be introduced to the world, and, he said, accepted with open arms by many professing Christians.
That's pretty provocative, yeah.
It really is, but you know what? Once you take that statement and start doing the research with that in mind, it's amazing. I've come to agree with Tom on that.
Yeah, it was. That was kind of a jaw-dropping moment because that's pretty bold, and you can understand now why he's not invited to speak before the National Association of Religious Broadcasters anymore.
Wow.
Well, from those of our listeners who are not familiar with some of those topics, because that word is probably not brought up very often on a lot of traditional Christian radio stations. Can you explain a little bit how an average listener here can understand dominionism and how it makes itself manifest amongst groups they may be familiar with?
In its most extreme form, dominionists believe that we literally have to retake the world for Christ in order to make it possible for Jesus Christ to return. Okay? You can see where that is, in fact, heretical, because it puts the power for the second coming in the hands of you and I as Christians. That is nowhere in Scripture. Now, that's the most extreme form. It is watered down and diluted a bit and fed to us as, essentially a form of patriotism. Mm-hmm. God bless America. And we need to protect ourselves against those radical Islamists who want to take down our way of life. They hate us because we're free. And again, it's very easy once you start down that path
I think
to take it to its extreme.
I think one way to just really short definition is dominionism is converting the world starting with the governments first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They take the Great Commission as, in its purest form, dominionism takes the Great Commission to preach to all the nations, as literally going to the heads of the nations and starting there.
Mm-hmm.
It's the trickle-down theory of evangelism.
But
there are a lot of parts in dominionism and groups that call themselves dominionists that have very heretical theology that is out-and-out New Age theology.
But a lot of these groups are very, very popular groups and are well known in Christian radio.